Sustainable gardening starts with a plant. Because as much as we wish growing a successful and high-yielding garden was as easy as snapping your finger against your green thumb, there's a lot more to it than that. Especially if you want to grow a garden that not only supports you and your family, but the environment as well. Hey everyone, it's Amber from Sustainable Jungle, where we share sustainability tips, tricks, hacks, products, brands, and stories to better our planet. And if that sounds like your vibe, please take a second to scroll down just a fraction and hit those like and subscribe buttons for us. And today's topic within sustainability is one of my favorites and my area of specialty, and that is gardening. Now, I've made a couple different videos on this topic in the past, so some of you may know that I am a huge garden nerd. My summer high school job was in a greenhouse, so I've pretty much been growing my own produce for years now. I'm on the board of directors for my local community garden. Point is, I love gardening and growing and all things green, and I've cultivated, get it, a lot of experience in that area by now. So, it is my favorite time of year where I get to start thinking about the upcoming growing season and take my first steps into making that a reality. And yes, I know it is still February, at least at the time of me filming this. It'll probably be March by the time this comes out. And also, yes, this is when I start my gardening process for the year, and maybe you should be too. Planting a garden, I know, can feel like a daunting task, but today I'm inviting you to plan mine with me. So we will go step by step through the process from midwinter seed inventory to actual planting day in late spring and early summer. And along the way, I will explain why I take certain steps in the name of sustainability and share tips that you can use to plan your own eco-friendly garden. First thing, before absolutely anything else that you'll really need to decide is whether you're going to plant the majority of your stuff from seed or just buy plant starts from, say, a greenhouse or a farmer's market. Now, no offense to greenhouses out there because, again, I worked in one for 7 years, so I know what I'm talking about, but I can honestly say that greenhouse prices are pretty ridiculous. I mean, you're talking about a seed and enough soil that costs practically pennies that gets a markup to like $10 for one plant. And yes, I know that there is a ton of labor and overhead behind running a greenhouse, and that isn't cheap, but for me, where I have both the knowledge and the capacity to just start from seed, it is an easy and huge money saver for me. Now, I will say that sometimes I do buy a couple of last-minute plug-in starts, which I get typically from local farms because they don't cost that much, and you'll actually find a lot of people selling these affordable starts at farmers markets in the early summer, so definitely check out your local one for that. Another reason that I go the seed route is that it allows me to be basically self-sufficient when it comes to seeds, and especially at this point in my gardening tenure where I've learned for the most part what plants I like and which ones I don't, I'm able to save a lot of my seeds at the end of the season so that I can plant them the next one. So basically what I do is I have these nice little organized tins or plastic things that have all these little mini ones in here. I label all of them, and then I just put my seeds in there. And then the important thing is that I save it in a cool but not cold and not humid environment throughout the winter, as that will help preserve the seeds for the longest amount of time. My local library also hosts a free seed library every spring, which is a community initiative where volunteers all get together and they donate, repackage, and organize any excess seeds that either they have or they've collected from other gardeners in the community. So if I do find myself that I am short on a few seeds, I can usually find them there. So if you've been wanting to get into gardening but you've been put off by the price of starts, don't be. Because just know that you can get to a point where you basically have to spend practically nothing on seeds each year. Okay, now the rest of this is assuming that you plan on starting at least some amount of your own plants from seeds. So I'm gonna walk you through what I do and importantly, when I start doing it. And it all starts for me in January. I'm not kidding. I wish I were, but I'm not. Why? Well, because I live in a climate where I have to start certain seeds in February or I won't get a harvest. Shout out to all my fellow Zone 5A and lower peeps out there. Now, if you have no idea what that means, then let's start there. And you should definitely start by learning what your growing zone is. And there is a ton of resources out there that let you look this up just by putting in your zip code, but I really like the Plant Maps website because it also gives you other useful information like the first and last frost dates, which if you've looked on the back of a lot of seed packets, you'll recall seeing things like start indoors in early spring and transplant after last date of frost. So you'll know that you also need to know these dates. Once you know those things, you can start to plan when you need to start your garden. So using myself as an example, again, I'm zone 5A, which is pretty cold if all the blue around me didn't give it away. And that excludes a lot of plants for me. My last date of frost here is also June 1st. So if I want to plant, say, Speedia Brussels sprouts, which is what I plant every year, by the way, and I see that they are listed at 98 days to maturity from date of transplant, well, I know that if I don't seed until May, I am not going to be able to plant until mid-June, in which case 98 days is not going to pass before my first date of frost on September 1st. Now, it is worth noting that the first and last dates of frost are really more of a general rule of thumb as opposed to a hard and fast rule. One thing you'll learn in gardening is that even the best laid plans, or in this case plants, can get totally uprooted by weird things. Last summer, for instance, we got a frost here on June 19th. Which unfortunately damaged my pumpkins and tomatoes. Meanwhile, we didn't get a fall frost until well into October. Gardening always comes with risks, and sometimes you just have to roll with it. It's also worth noting that frost is not a death sentence to all plants. I start planting my hardier crops like carrots and onions in mid-May since I know that they can handle a little bit of frost. Whereas more sensitive plants like tomatoes, squash, peppers, I wait until early June when the risk of frost has mostly passed, as last summer taught me. So, knowing all that, I've determined that based on my location climate, I need to kick off my planting calendar in January. Now, obviously, I don't start planting quite yet, but I do use this quiet month to take inventory of my seeds, plan my plants, plan out the layout of my garden, and that way I also know if I need to order anything that I am missing. So, each year I keep a little chart of everything that I plant, and each one is going to have the maturity time, when I sow it, when I sprouted, when I transplanted it, when I harvested it, and then any other notes that I think are kind of important that just tells me how it performed. This way, I can remember what specific varieties I planted, which ones worked, and which ones I probably won't try again. For example, last year I experimented with sweet potatoes for the first time. Now, I don't live in a climate that's typically conducive for sweet potatoes, which like it really hot, both in the soil and the air. So I did all sorts of things trying to counteract this, like putting black weed mite down and cutting holes on it for each slip to come up through, and that helped retain soil heat. I even put a mini hoop house over it for the entire month of June. And while yes, I did actually get some potatoes, they were pretty small, and it honestly just wasn't worth all that extra effort for the yield that I ended up getting. And because my chart reflects those notes, I know that in following years to probably not try that again. Now, if you're a somewhat tech-savvy person, you could probably make a much neater and prettier version of this on a computer spreadsheet program, but I'm old school, I'm a pen and paper list kind of gal, and I also like being able to easily take this to the garden and reference it if I need it. So when you're actually picking your plants and coming up with this plan, here are some considerations to keep in mind. Number one, what do you eat? Obviously, it's silly to plant vegetables that you hate. I spent my first few years gardening planting way more tomatoes than I would ever actually eat. And in fact, nowadays I mostly use tomatoes for canning only to make my own sauces and salsas, so I pretty much only plant paste varieties. And yes, paste versus non-paste tomatoes makes a huge difference. Like, obviously you can make sauce out of any tomato, but it is a way bigger hassle if you're using a non-paste tomato. Once you've kind of determined what you eat, I recommend that you start with just simple staples. Gardening already involves a lot of experimentation, so only experiment with tricky varieties as you gain experience and you get comfortable with the basics. And of course, you should also aim for variety though. You want a biodiverse garden, as this is going to be better for the plants, the insect populations, all of it. And if you really want only a few staple crops, an easy way to add diversity is just planting herbs here and there throughout the bed. They take up hardly any space, they don't have super expansive root systems, and they will provide all kinds of pest repelling benefits. Once I figure out what plants I'm going to plant, I need to figure out where I'm going to plant them, which is ultimately what's going to determine how many of each of them I need to plant. So I turned once again to my handy dandy notebook, and I sketch out little beds. And I've experimented with some garden planning software and apps out there, and I just find them really clunky and limiting, so messy little sketches it is, and it works for me. And let me tell you, these little maps are super helpful, especially in the early days of your garden when you get to play the friend or foe game, aka is this a weed or is this a plant that I planted? So knowing what you planted there can really help you identify which is which. Now, to give you an idea of what kind of space I'm working with, I have a total of 3 raised garden beds to account for, plus some smaller troughs and pots that I use for things like herbs. 2 of these are 4x8 beds that I have at my house, and then I have a 10 by 16 foot bed at my community garden. So it's spacious, but not vastly spacious. I desperately want to move somewhere where I have more gardening space, but this is what I have for now, so I do need to be mindful of that and try not to go overboard with my planting, which I tend to do every year anyway. Maybe you've seen this hyperbole and a half inspired meme floating around on the internet. Yeah, that's me. Now, when I'm making my map, I try to keep it simple, but I do follow 2 key principles, which are crop rotation and companion planting. Rotating crops is important because different plants have different nutritional needs. For example, carrots are really heavy feeders that deplete the soil of certain nutrients, so they shouldn't be planted in the same spot 2 years in a row. And companion planting refers to a strategy in which you pair plants strategically because, like most people, not all plants actually get along, and there are tons of different pairings and rules of thumb out there, but here is a handy list of some rules that I like to follow of things that pair well together. Tomatoes and basil. Basil repels pests like aphids, and it also supposedly enhances tomato growth and flavor. I've never really done an experiment where I've tried tomatoes not planted with basil and compared in the same season to see if they're tastier, but that might be a worthwhile experiment doing. Number 2 is carrots and onions. Onions help deter carrot flies, and then the carrots also help loosen the soil for the onions. Next, we have corns, beans, and squash. These are called the 3 sisters of the gardening world. So basically, beans fix nitrogen to the soil, corn provides support, and squash shades soil. Try saying that 3 times fast, which can also help the soil retain moisture and deter weed growth. Next, there's lettuce and radishes. Radishes will break up the soil for lettuce roots, and then the lettuce in turn shades the radishes, which prevents them from getting too woody. If you've ever had a woody radish, it's pretty awful. Then there's cucumbers and nasturtiums. Nasturtiums repel cucumber beetles and also improve pollination. Peppers and marigolds are one of my personal favorite ones. Marigolds both deter nematoids and aphids that damage peppers. And then, of course, we also have potatoes and horseradish. I don't really do this one just because I know that horseradish doesn't actually grow very well for me here, but if you live in an area where horseradish does grow pretty well, horseradish deters pests like Colorado potato beetles. And then, of course, I do use strawberries and borage as a combination all the time. Borage basically attracts tons of pollinators, and then it deters pests like caterpillars, which will just have a feast on your strawberries. If you grow cabbage, plant dill with it. Dill is going to attract predatory insects that eat cabbage worms. And then you should also plant beans and marigolds together. Marigolds in general are a really great plant for your garden, but in regards to beans specifically, they repel Mexican bean beetles. There's also some plants that you should avoid planting together, like tomatoes and potatoes. I know they rhyme, they seem like they should go well together, but they don't. Both of them are super prone to blight, and if one catches it, it can actually spread it to the other. You also shouldn't plant carrots and dill together because dill can stunt the carrot growth and cause some really misshapen roots to occur. Beans should never be planted with either onions or garlic. Both of them are going to inhibit bean growth. Cabbage and strawberries shouldn't be planted together. I didn't know this, and I actually made this mistake last year. But strawberries attract pests that will destroy your cabbages. Mine got a bunch of earwigs. I don't know if that will actually help not planting them near the strawberries because earwigs are just really big where I live in general. And then last, you shouldn't plant either corn and tomatoes or potatoes and cucumbers together, and that's because both of those different plants are going to attract similar types of pests, so they're going to be susceptible to the same kind of pests, diseases, all that kind of stuff. Now, you'll notice that some of these are non-crops like marigolds, which I mentioned are just really great to plant anyway, and this is just a good lesson for planting. I always plant a few pollinator plants just throughout my beds just to give food to the bees and the butterflies and to encourage them to come and pollinate my plants. I typically do borage. One is enough because it gets really big, and cosmos, these are my 2 favorite ones, because then the cosmos I can cut, and then I have cut flowers in my house all through the summer. I do also like to plant herbs all around the edges of my bed, A, because they don't take up much space, and B, because a lot of herbs repel different types of pests. And of course, keep in mind that different plants have different space requirements. A summer squash like zucchini is going to take up a lot more space than a vining winter squash. In fact, I don't recommend planting zucchini in a raised bed at all, and if you do, start with only one because you will be amazed at how much it produces. I don't plant zucchini at all because our community garden has a communal zucchini plant section, and there's only like 3 of them, and even so, we still end up with way more zucchini than we can pawn off on like our 60+ member gardeners, so we end up donating a lot of it to the food bank. To maximize what I can fit in my somewhat limited space, I use certain aspects of the French intensive method, which was developed centuries ago in France to maximize yield in limited space. So one concept used here is to take advantage of directional root systems. So things like carrot obviously have a vertical root, whereas things like squash have roots that are going to spread out horizontal. So you can actually intersperse complementary plants like this together. So I typically place carrots in between all of my melons and squash. You can also save space by using trellises for vining plants like winter squash and melons. But then you will need to consider the shade that this is going to create for the rest of your garden. Now, of course, you can use this strategically to actually provide shade to cooler loving plants. Just make sure you know which directions the sun are coming from so you know where to plant those plants in relation to your trellis. See, planting your garden is like a little puzzle. I think it's kind of fun, but maybe that's just me. You can also consider succession planting at this stage. What is succession planting? Well, it's basically the practice of planting crops in intervals to ensure a continuous harvest throughout the growing season. A schedule might look like this. I mean, mine definitely does not look this neat and organized, and I'm really envious of those who are organized enough to do things like this. But unfortunately, my growing season is also really short, so I can get 2 rounds of crops, like at most, except for things that have really short maturation times like lettuces. But if you live somewhere more temperate, you can often get multiple rounds by doing this. So for instance, I plant cold weather carrots, then I plant warm weather carrot varieties after I've harvested the first one. Peas and beans are both vining climbing plants that have pretty short maturation times, but the former likes cold weather and the latter likes heat. So once my peas are done in the early summer, I take those out and then I put beans in their place. I always consider my garlic too, because I know that I will be digging this up in late June or July. I would have planted it last October, but that means going to leave me with a pretty big empty space in my bed because I plant a lot of garlic. So I usually use this space to plant lettuce and things that aren't going to take very long that I can realistically get in the last couple months of summer. As you can see, this sort of involves knowing what plants like is certain temperatures, so if you're a beginner gardener just getting your feet wet, I suggest focusing on the basics before trying this, and then maybe incorporating succession techniques in future seasons. Now, once I've planned out my garden, I look at everything that I want to plant, and I compare that to my seed stock that I currently have, basically taking stock, seeing if I'm low on anything, seeing if there's any gaps, any seeds that I just don't have. And as noted, I save my seeds at the end of each season, so my garden is more or less self-sustaining, but there are certain things that are really tricky to save seeds for, like carrots. So I always end up either buying or getting these sort of things from the seed library. But even more than that, I always allow myself a little bit of room to play and experiment with a few fun new varieties each year. Last year, I tried glass gem corn, and while it looked lovely, the kernels were so hard I couldn't eat them. I'm still not sure what went wrong, but I probably won't try that again. On the other hand, I also tried a new melon called a divergent melon, which is basically just a small cantaloupe, and I loved it. It had a consistent yield, amazing flavor, and it was super hardy even in my cold climate with our mid-June frost. So I'm now planning on just making that my staple melon crop each year. So my point is that experimenting with a few fun new varieties always is really rewarding because sometimes it leads you to find that plant that you never knew you were missing. So for those, I take to my seed catalogs. Now, I buy exclusively non-GMO and heirloom seeds, and if you want to know more on why that's important for garden sustainability, I do have another video on that topic exclusively, so I do recommend checking that out. But for this reason, I shop exclusively from sustainable seed companies like Fedco and Baker Creek Rare Seeds. These are my 2 favorite ones. And I actually have a whole list of some other ones that I do recommend that I will link to down below. So this year, these just came in the mail the other day, but I'm trying out these beautiful dragon tongue beans. I'm really excited. They're very pretty, which is often how I pick my unusual fun varieties. And again, sometimes I get really cool stuff out of it. So again, I get this stuff ordered and planned in February typically, and that's also when I do start planting a few of my seeds. Not too many, just those that I know have a really long germination and or maturation period, like my Brussels sprouts, my onions, and my peppers mostly. Starting these seeds this early might seem really ambitious, but it is essential for colder climates like mine. And a common misconception is that you need a greenhouse to plant early, but I just want to tell you firsthand that you do not. I do live in a 400 square foot tiny house, and I managed to do it here. So if I can do it, you can do it. And while I would never go so far as to say that this is ideal, it's what I have and I make it work. And I've made my spring seeding process a lot more efficient year by year. So here's what I do. So I plant my early seeds either in old Teflon bakeware that I don't bake in anymore because Teflon's not good for you, or in these plastic egg cartons. I like to use the plastic ones for my early seeds because I've learned that with over 3 months of watering in the cardboard ones, those cardboard containers are pretty much ready to fall apart by the time you're ready to plant them. So for the early seeds, the plastic ones are just a little bit more durable, but I do use the paper ones for my later batches of seeds. And then when it comes time to actually plant, I always recommend that you start with a high quality seed starting mix. It should be really light and airy. A bad quality packed soil is not going to be well received by your seeds. So I like the Whitney Farms organic mix, and a bag of this size lasts me a few seasons, so it doesn't really cost me that much. I add it to my trays, I water in the soil, and then once I do that, I add the seeds to it, and then I put them on a seed starting heat mat. Now, if you don't have one that's specifically designed for seeds like this one is, you can use something like an old electric blanket, especially if you don't care if it really gets dirty. That's what I did when I first started really gardening. And this is going to help the seeds germinate a lot more quickly, especially for things like peppers, which need the soil to be between like 70 and 85 degrees to even germinate. You definitely need something like that. And then wherever I set these, I also use this little clip-on UV light to put over it. So I can turn it on, and it looks like that. So I especially turn it on overnight just to give them a little bit of sunlight when I know that my daylight hours are still a little bit limited throughout the winter. And then once I plant more seeds in April, I actually place all of my seed trays in a rolling clear plastic drawer storage set. You've probably seen them at like stores like Walmart, things like that, because it kind of acts like this little mini greenhouse on wheels. So I can roll it in at night, out in the day, basically wherever I need to around my house, put them in the sunshine, whatever. And this little hack has saved me tons of space. Before I started this, I used to literally just lay all of my seed trays out on this table, which is also my kitchen table, by the way. So I just basically couldn't use the table for like 2 months. And then we get to March, which is the wait. And this is where I'm at right now in my spring garden timeline. So let's look ahead at the next steps that I will be completing so you have an idea of what comes next and how to time things from this point on. Now, I pretty much don't do anything in March. I just keep my few seed trays that I've started watered, alive, tracking them when they start to sprout, that kind of stuff. Which is good because I'm about to head off on vacation in March. So stay tuned on a little video on sustainable travel once I'm back. So by the time I'm back, it'll be almost April, which means it'll be almost time to start the rest of my seeds, except for those that I will direct sow, like carrots. And then by the end of April, I will begin to harden off all of my seedlings. So this is a gradual process of getting them used to outdoor conditions like sunlight, wind, and temperature fluctuations. Basically how I do that is I just roll my little mini greenhouse right outside during the day. I bring it back in at night. As they've started to do that after about a week, as long as the nights aren't super cold, I will leave them out at night in their little greenhouses. And this step is really crucial to preventing transplant shock when you do finally put them outside permanently in the ground. And then when May rolls around, I finally get to start actually planting. Now, as I noted, sometimes freak weather happens, so if you are planting outside before your last day of frost especially, definitely be prepared to cover your plants if necessary, like with greenhouse plastic or frost cloth. I'm also careful to only transplant hardier things in May, like pretty much anything in the brassica family, onions, carrots, etc. Those are going to be fine, but then I wait until the first week of June to plant any sensitive plants. And that's my garden planning process, at least from start to finish. Then the real work begins. No, I mean, in all honesty, gardening is a lot of work, and there's not actually a lot of downtime when you consider how late into the fall harvest preservation goes and how early some of us have to start things, but it is so worth it. There are a few things I've endeavored to do that has been as fulfilling as growing my own food. And I think especially now with supply chains and tariffs and things making all of that pretty questionable, I think it's going to become more important than ever. So I hope that this video empowers you a little bit and helps you plan your own sustainable garden. Whether you're working with a tiny, unconventional space like mine, or you have plenty of land to work with, the principles are basically going to be the same. Plan ahead, think sustainably, and enjoy the process. If you're a seasoned gardener with tips that you would like to add, please do drop them below. I myself am still always learning in this field, so I would appreciate it, as I'm sure other viewers would as well. And if you have questions, drop those down there too, and I'll do my very best to answer them. Maybe someone else out there will have the answer. And please, once again, if you haven't subscribed to us, please do, and hit that notification bell, as we have tons of fun and practical content like this planned for the year, and I'd hate for you to miss out on any of it. Thanks so much for watching today. This is Amber from Sustainable Jungle.